In 1985, 36-year-old Michael Reamer was a roofer in Tacoma, Washington, and his boss described him as being a work hard, play hard type of guy. In the winter months, when there really wasn't any roofing to be done, Mike would supplement his income by trapping coyote, mink, and muskrat in the forest that butted up against the Nisqually River, which was an 80-mile stretch that ran right near his home. Most of the traps Mike would set would be far away from any actual trail, because wherever there was a trail, you would have human foot traffic, and that would scare away the animals that you're trying to catch in your trap. And so as a result, he would place his traps in very remote, isolated sections of the forest, which meant he needed to know where those sections were. And so over the 15 years he spent trapping in this forest, he got really, really good at navigating it. It was like he had a map in his head of where everything was in this forest. Plus, Mike was already an avid outdoorsman, and so navigating a forest and being out in the wild was something that just kind of came naturally to him. Mike's girlfriend was a 21-year-old woman named Diana Robertson, and they had a 2-year-old daughter named Crystal. Mike and Diana had a rocky relationship, to say the least. In fact, in October of that year, Diana had filed a restraining order against Mike after he had kicked in the door and thrown her to the ground. Mike also always carried a gun on him, and he had a very quick temper. But despite their significant relationship issues, the one thing they could always see eye to eye on was their daughter, Crystal. They adored her, and when it came to decisions about her, they were always on the same page. It was whatever is in the best interest of Crystal. In December of that year, Diana and Mike were able to reconcile, and so Diana threw the restraining order out. And in fact, she and Crystal moved back in with Mike, which made Crystal very, very happy. Just a couple of days after moving back in, they decided they wanted to go out and go camping together as a family, and then also pick out a real Christmas tree they could bring back for the holidays. And so they settled on an area that was going to be in the same forest where Mike had all of his traps set, and they figured they could, get their family time in, they could get their Christmas tree, and Mike would be able to check his traps, saving himself from making another trip later on. So on December 12th, the three of them loaded up into Mike's red pickup truck, and they drove the 30 minutes down towards Nisqually River, where there was this logging road that Mike would use to park his truck and then walk in to check his traps. So Mike pulls over on the side of the road, they all hop out, and Mike leads the way right into the middle of the woods. There's no trail. Mike is just bringing them to an area where 1, his traps will be, and 2, he thinks is suitable for camping and for looking for a Christmas tree. Later that afternoon, Crystal was spotted walking around a parking lot of a Kmart 20 miles away from where Mike had parked the car near Nisqually River. And she's just walking around, she looks totally confused, she's all alone, and the employees of the Kmart are looking out, and they see this girl, and they're all watching, waiting for, her parents or a guardian or someone to walk over and show that they are with this girl. But after a couple of minutes, when no one does that, one of the employees goes out and tries to talk to her. And this employee would say when she talked to the girl, she kept looking over her shoulder and she was just terrified the whole time. And so this employee asked her, what's your name? And she didn't say anything. She asked her, where are you coming from? Where are your parents? Who's looking after you? And to all the questions she was asked, she didn't say anything. She just looked terrified and was looking over her shoulder. And so this employee brings the girl back inside and they call the police. And so the police show up and they ask the girl the same questions that the employees have been asking her, and the girl's still not speaking. And so after they made an announcement inside to say, hey, is anybody in here the parent or guardian of this child? And no one came forward. They said, okay, well, we have no other choice, but we're gonna have to move her to temporary foster care. And so they move her to a foster home, and then they put an ad out in the newspaper that day with a picture of her, basically saying, if you know me, contact this number. 2 days later, Crystal's maternal grandmother would see the picture in the newspaper, and the ad did not have a description of, how she was discovered. It just said she had been found at this particular Kmart, and if you know who she is, please contact this number. Even without the details, the grandmother knows something has gone wrong, because there's no reason in the world those two parents would abandon their beloved Crystal. And so she calls Diana, she calls Mike, they don't pick up the phone. That's when she calls the number and she says, what's going on? I'm her grandmother, where is she? The police tell her to go to the foster home and they will meet her there and they're going to talk about what happened. So the grandmother flies to the foster home and she arrives there before the police. She goes inside and Crystal is so happy to see her. It's the first time Crystal has really broken out of that kind of catatonic state she had been in ever since she was found at the Kmart. So she runs up to her grandmother, they have this reunion, and the grandmother's so happy to see Crystal, but she's also thinking, where are your parents? Where are Diana and Mike? And so she asks Crystal, where are they, honey? Where is your mom? Where's your dad? And Crystal would speak to her grandmother and she would say, Mommy's in the trees. Her grandmother didn't know what this meant, and so she tried to ask clarifying questions, but Crystal was not very verbal. She was not able to articulate more than what she was saying, so she just kept repeating it, saying, "Mommy's in the trees, mommy's in the trees." And so then the police show up, and the grandmother turns to them and she says, "Where are her parents? Where are Mike and Diana?" And the police turn to her and they're like, "We don't know. We found her abandoned in this parking lot and she wasn't speaking and no one knew anything about her. And so until right now, we didn't even know her parents' names. Do you have any idea where they might be?" And the grandmother's like, "I have no idea. I mean, I'm just learning about all of this stuff now. But when I came over here, Crystal said to me, 'Mommy's in the trees.'" And she's not very verbal, so she can't explain much more than that. But she just kept saying, "Mommy's in the trees." And I know Mike liked to go camping in this one area near the Nisqually River. He keeps traps out near the edge of the water. He catches some small animals out there. So I know he goes out there and goes camping. And so maybe that's what Crystal's referencing, that they were in the trees. So they were in that forest over there. The grandmother also gave the police the address to Mike's house, and the police used that information to launch their search for the parents. And so the first place they go is Mike's house, and all the lights are off, the door is locked, and his red pickup truck, because the grandmother said he drove a red pickup truck, his red pickup truck is not there. And so they rule out his house, they're not there, and they begin flying a plane not only over Tacoma, which is the area where they were living, but also over that forest that was right up against the Nisqually River. And as they're flying, they're looking for campsites that could potentially be Mike and Diana, but they're also looking for the red pickup truck, which is fairly distinctive. And after a couple of days of flying all over the forest and looking around the side streets and putting people in the forest walking on foot, they couldn't find anything and they turned the search off. And they would tell the grandmother and the rest of the family on Diana's and Mike's side that they really just needed to wait for more information to come in because they couldn't just spend an indefinite amount of time scanning a fairly large area. They have all of Tacoma and this huge forest. And so everyone just had to wait. 2 months later, a man and his dog were out walking on this logging road that was about 10 miles away from the Nisqually River and 30 miles away from the Kmart where Crystal was found. And they're walking on this road and they see way off in the distance, there's this truck that's pulled over to the side of this road. And even from a distance, they can tell it's covered in snow. But it hasn't snowed recently. There's snow on the ground, but the amount of snow that is on this truck indicates it's been sitting here for quite a while. And so as they get closer to the truck, this man is looking around, seeing if maybe the owner is nearby, even though it seemed unlikely given the fact that it looks like it's been sitting here a while. And so after he stands there for a minute looking around, feeling pretty confident there's no one in the area, he brushes the snow off the passenger side window and he looks inside and he doesn't see anything at first, but he notices on the passenger front seat, there's a significant amount of blood on the seat, or what appears to be blood. And this startles the guy, so he backs up from it and he and his dog very quickly leave this area because they're in this kind of desolate, logging road. He's pretty isolated. And so he gets out of there as quickly as he can. And when he gets to a phone, he calls the police. Police show up and they brush the rest of the snow off and they find it is a red pickup truck. It's Mike's red pickup truck. Mike and Diana's case had been very big news in the area when it happened, and the news had really not gone away. People were out there looking for this couple. And so as soon as they saw this was Mike's truck, they start fanning out and searching the area, seeing if they can find any other clues about what happened to Mike and Diana. And very quickly, they discovered Diana's body. She was located not far from the red truck, just barely off the road in the forest. She was under several inches of snow, and she had been stabbed 17 times, and there was a tube sock wrapped around her neck. There was no sign of Mike, but once they got inside the truck, there was a manila folder that had been tucked up on the dashboard that just said, "I love you, Diana." When police showed that message to Diana's family, they all said, "That looks like Mike's handwriting. He used to send us handwritten Christmas cards, and that looks exactly the way he writes." As for the blood that was on the passenger seat inside the truck, it had been sitting out for too long, so they weren't able to determine whose blood it was, but they were able to determine it was human. So between the blood on the front seat, the note that was left on the dashboard, the personal furious nature of the way in which Diana was killed, combined with Mike's history of violence and his disappearance, because he's not here anymore, that all made it seem an awful lot like Mike was the guy that did this. In fact, this made for a very tidy ending to a mystery that had actually started before Diana had been killed. On August 10th, 1985, so 4 months before Mike, Diana, and Crystal ventured off into the woods near Nisqually River, 27-year-old Stephen Harkins and his girlfriend, 42-year-old Ruth Cooper, were going camping near Nisqually River in the same forest. They were actually about 15 miles from where Diana's body was ultimately found. and they were very close to a number of Mike's traps, although they probably didn't realize they were near them. During their trip, an unknown assailant walked up to their campsite in the middle of the night and shot them both to death. Stephen was found right away, and he was found inside of his sleeping bag at their campsite, indicating he had been killed in his sleep. Ruth wasn't found for months, and when she was found 1.5 miles away from the campsite, and she had a tube sock tied around her neck, the same way Diana had. And the knot that was used on the tube sock was even the same as the knot used on Diana's tube sock. So the similarity was just too much to overlook. And so to the police, they're thinking, Mike has to be the guy in both of these cases. He attacked Ruth and Stephen, perhaps because they were, on his territory where his traps were, and he didn't like that. He has a history of violence, and so he attacks them. And then a couple months later, he attacks Diana, and then he flees. As for his daughter being found alive at the Kmart, it would seem he just did not have it in him to harm his own child, and so he dropped her off at the Kmart before he ultimately fled. Despite everything seeming to fit just perfectly to where, yep, Mike is definitely the guy, not only for Diana, but for Ruth and for Stephen, we figured it out. Despite that being the overwhelming feeling, there were a couple of questions that remained unanswered, like the FBI. They were unable to confirm the handwriting on that folder that said, "I love you, Diana." They were unable to confirm that that in fact was Mike's handwriting. Diana's family was really convinced it was his, but the FBI said it's not necessarily a match. And then you have the motives for the two crimes. We can understand one of them. Him attacking Diana, unfortunately, people attack their partners all the time, and so we can understand that, we can rationalize that. But for him to attack Ruth and Stephen, two total strangers, because they encroached on your land, even though it's not your land, it's public land, and you just happen to put your traps out there, that didn't seem like a strong enough reason for him to want to kill them. But the circumstantial evidence was overwhelmingly pointing at Mike being the guy. You have the fact that he's this violent guy with a history of domestic abuse. He knows this area well where both crimes were committed. You have the tube sock tied around Diana the same way it's tied around Ruth. It just had to be Mike. And so because the police felt so strongly it had to be Mike, they were willing to overlook these lingering questions. And so the police wanted to issue an arrest warrant for Mike, but they needed to be able to prove he was alive, because if he was dead, then that calls into question his ability to have committed these two crimes. And so they didn't have proof he was alive. And so very quickly, this story faded out of the headlines because basically everybody believed Mike had done it and he had run off somewhere, and maybe someday we'll figure out where he went and we'll bring him to justice. But until then, we know he's the guy. For years, no one heard from Mike, no one saw Mike. It was like he had just totally vanished. Crystal was raised by relatives, and many of the detectives that were working on these cases eventually retired or moved on. Then, 25 years later, in March of 2011, a hiker was walking through the forest near the Nisqually River, about 1 mile from where Diana's body was found, and they would stumble upon a piece of a human skull. She calls the police show up, they search the area, and they discover another bone, a human jawbone. And it would turn out it was Mike's. The rest of Mike's remains were never found, and because there was so little of him to work with, police were not able to determine a cause of death. However, they were able to date his death back to almost exactly the same time frame that Diana had died. Additionally, investigators believe the reason they did not find more of Mike's remains is because he had been buried. The two bones that were found, the skull and the jawbone, they were located within 1 mile of where Diana's body had been found, and that area, after Diana had been found, had been scoured. They looked everywhere for clues, and because he apparently died at the same time she did, he would have been out there and they would have found him. So the fact that they didn't find him can only mean he was underground. So this all meant Mike could not have been the killer, because in order for him to have been the killer, he not only would have had to attack Diana and then drive his daughter to the Kmart and then drive back to the forest, he would then need to take his own life and then also somehow bury himself. Some of the police officers that had worked that case were still on the police force, and so when they heard this news about Mike not being the killer, they were like, it never really made any sense that he would attack Ruth or Stephen, unless he was a serial killer. And then it clicked. They probably were dealing with a serial killer. It just wasn't Mike. And their only eyewitness was the toddler, Crystal, who apparently the serial killer could not bring themselves to harm. And so as a result, Crystal just sat there and watched these horrible things happen to her parents, and then probably spent a fair amount of time with the serial killer afterwards because they needed to drive her to the Kmart. Investigators and her family had tried to get her to give more information about what she had witnessed, but all she could say was, "Mommy's in the trees." And so there are really only two interpretations of what that means. Either one, she was just stating that her mother was in the forest, and that would have been accurate, or she's remembering her mother trying to escape a serial killer by climbing up into a tree. Or maybe even that she was in the tree with her mother as they both were trying to escape a serial killer with a knife. So when the police have this revelation that Mike was not the killer, that in fact it was probably a serial killer, and we know nothing about this serial killer besides what Crystal had to say as a toddler, and that didn't provide any sort of real clarity on who this person was or what their MO was, they went back and looked at all the unsolved murders in the Pacific Northwest, specifically around this forest. They discovered that in addition to Mike and Diana and Ruth and Stephen, there were 4 other sets of couples that were killed in and around this forest, and all of them bared striking resemblances to one another. The most recent attack that is associated with the tube sock killer occurred in 2006, but the reality is police don't really know anything about the tube sock killer. All they know is that they're probably in the Pacific Northwest, and they are definitely still at large. Today, the next and final story of today's episode is called Where Did He Go? In mid-August 2013, Mike and Karen Laspisa helped their beloved only child, 19-year-old Bryce Laspisa, get all of his things packed up and into the family car. Bryce had just spent the summer with his parents in their home in Laguna Niguel, California, which is one of the nicest places to live in the entire country. But now that the summer was coming to an end, it was time for Bryce to head back to Sierra College in Rocklin, California, where he was set to start his sophomore year. Once all of his things were packed inside the trunk of the car, all 3 of them hopped inside and then made the 7-hour drive north to his campus. Once his parents had moved him into his apartment, they gave him a hug and a kiss and wished him luck, and then they left. On their ride back home, Mike and Karen talked about how well their son seemed to be doing. He loved his school, he loved the program he was in graphic design, he was a very gifted artist, he had lots of friends, he had a wonderful girlfriend. It just seemed like he was living his best life and he was on the path to success. So nothing could prepare them for what their son did 2 weeks later. Just a couple of days after getting dropped off at school, Bryce's very close friend and roommate, Sean, and Bryce's girlfriend, Kim, noticed Bryce was acting erratically. Specifically, he was drinking a ton of hard alcohol. Now, Bryce was no saint. He liked to drink and party like many other kids his age did, but the amount of alcohol he was consuming was concerning. Also, Bryce began experimenting with a drug called Vyvanse, which is a very powerful stimulant that's normally used to treat attention deficit disorder. Now, Bryce didn't have attention deficit disorder. He was taking it in order to stay up late at night and play video games. But between the heavy drinking and the drug use, it seemed like Bryce's personality was starting to change. He was becoming anxious and skittish and kind of paranoid. And so finally, Sean and Kim confronted him about his substance abuse and asked him, what's going on? What's causing you to act this way? And Bryce would say, nothing, guys, I'm fine. I'm just, drinking and doing whatever I want to do. It's not a big deal. But Sean and Kim, they weren't buying it. They were convinced that something bad had happened to Bryce, and the way he was coping with it was by drinking really heavily and taking this drug. On August 28th, so about 2 weeks after Bryce has been dropped back off at school by his parents, Bryce and his roommate Sean were alone in their apartment together. And at some point, as they're sitting there just kind of minding their own business, Bryce says to Sean, "Hey, I want to give you something." And he takes his diamond earrings out and he gives them to Sean. And Sean's looking at these earrings and he's like, didn't your mom give these to you? Aren't these important to you? These are expensive. And Bryce just says, "No, I want you to have them." And so Sean is looking at these earrings, looking back at Bryce, wondering what's going on here. And then before he can even refuse the gift, Bryce is grabbing his Xbox and putting it on the table and telling Sean, "I want you to have this too. Take my Xbox." And so Sean is like, "I can't accept these 2 things. These are expensive. These are valuable to you. What's going on here?" But Bryce would just say, "Look, man, I want you to have these things. You're important to me and I want to give these to you." And so as Sean is sitting there wondering how to handle this very strange offering, he watched Bryce pull his phone out and begin really aggressively texting somebody. And then after a while, Bryce looks up from his phone and he tells Sean, "Hey, just so you know, I broke up with Kim." At this point, Sean knows, okay, something is definitely wrong here. There's no reason Bryce would break up with Kim. They were such a loving couple. They doted on each other. They were very close. They had just seen each other earlier in the day. Nothing seemed to be wrong. And so now Bryce is text breaking up with her. It didn't make any sense. Plus, Bryce is now trying to give him all these valuable things. It just wasn't really adding up. And so Sean decided he needed to get in touch with Bryce's parents because clearly someone needed to intervene. And so Sean waited until Bryce left. Bryce actually left to go talk to Kim. And at that point, Sean got his phone out and he looked up Bryce's parents and he called them. Bryce's mother, Karen, she picks up the phone and Sean explains that, your son, he's acting strangely, he's abusing drugs and alcohol, and I wouldn't be doing this unless I thought there was a problem. Like, I'm not trying to get him in trouble. I want you to reach out to him and see what's going on because I think there's a problem. And so Karen was alarmed by this. She had no idea any of this was going on. And she says, okay, I'll reach out to my son. Thank you for telling me. And so they hang up. And before Karen can even call Bryce, Bryce is calling her. And so Karen answers the phone, but it's not Bryce. It's Kim, his now ex-girlfriend. And she says to Karen, hey, I'm sorry to just call you like this, but your son, he just showed up at my apartment and he's acting so strangely that I actually took his keys. I don't want him to drive. There's something wrong with him. It's hard to describe, but he just seems totally off. And so now Karen's really concerned because just seconds ago, Sean has told her basically the same thing. And so Karen asks Kim, will you please put my son on the phone? Bryce picks up the phone and he says, hey, Mom, and he sounds totally normal. And she asks him, what's going on? I keep hearing that you're acting strangely and, what are you doing over at Kim's apartment? What's going on here? And Bryce would tell his mom that, look, Mom, I just broke up with Kim. It's a very messy breakup. That's why she's calling you. She's upset. And, that's why I'm over here. We're talking about it. And look, at this point, I just really want to go home. I want to go back to my apartment, but she has my keys. Can you please tell her to give me my car keys back so I can leave? But Karen wasn't really buying it. She knew her son really well, and it just seemed totally strange that two of his very close friends in his inner circle would say the same thing independent of one another. And so she says, you know what, Bryce, look, I want you to just stay there and I'm going to fly out there first thing tomorrow morning and I'm going to just see what's going on out there. And at this, Bryce immediately says, no, Mom, I have a lot to talk to you about. And until I talk to you about it, I don't want you coming out here. And so Karen's like, what do you mean you have a lot to talk to me about? What is it that you have to talk to me about? I don't really understand. But Bryce refused to elaborate over the phone, which Karen thought was very odd because Bryce was remarkably forthcoming with his parents. They had a very open relationship. They were very honest with each other. So for him to not even give a hint at whatever it was that was on his mind that in some way had to do with what was going on here, it just seemed very odd and unnecessarily cryptic. And so Karen gave up trying to get more information out of her son, and instead, she put her husband on the phone. And he asked Bryce, hey, what's going on here? Are you okay? And your mom tells me there's some problem, like what's going on here? And Bryce again just reiterates, look, Dad, I just broke up with my girlfriend. That's all that's going on here. There's no need to be concerned. I just need one of you to tell Kim to give me my keys back so I can go back to my apartment. That's all I need right now. And so Mike felt convinced that his son was totally fine, even though it did seem odd that two of his friends had said he was acting erratically. But from Mike's perspective, Bryce seemed just fine. And so he said as much to Karen and thought, let's just get Kim to give him his keys back and he can go back to his apartment and we can talk to him later about whatever it is that's going on. And so reluctantly, Karen gets back on the phone and she asks to speak with Kim. And she says, hey, Kim, would you mind giving our son his keys back? He'd like to leave. And so Kim says, okay, I'll give him his keys. And then they hung up. And then Kim got the keys out. She gave them to Bryce and Bryce left. At about 11:30 p.m. that night, Bryce was in his car. He was getting ready to leave when his mom called him back and said, okay, look, I want you to go home, but as soon as you get there, just give me a call so I know you're safe. And Bryce said, no problem, I'll give you a call. About an hour and a half later at 1 a.m., Bryce called his mom back to let her know that he was home safe at his apartment, and Karen and Mike are totally relieved, and they tell their son, okay, we'll talk to you tomorrow morning. 10 hours later at 11 a.m. on August 29th, Karen received an automated phone call from her car insurance company letting her know that roadside assistance had been used on their 2003 Toyota Highlander car. That was Bryce's car. And so Karen's totally confused because the last she spoke to her son, he was at his apartment. He was home safe. He did not have any car problems. And so she's thinking, did he get up early this morning and get into an accident and call roadside assistance? Or maybe last night he got into car problems and just didn't tell her about it, but they were minor. And so she calls Bryce, but Bryce doesn't pick up. And so she dials his roommate, Sean. Sean does answer the phone, and she says, hey, would you mind putting Bryce on the line? But Sean says, Bryce isn't here, and he didn't come home last night. Considering the general weirdness around their son's recent behavior, this really shocked Karen and Mike. At first, they thought we need to call the police because something horrible has happened, but then they thought, well, wait a minute, let's go into his bank statements because he has a credit card that we gave him, and let's see if there's any recent purchases that will allow us to track where he is. And so they pull up his bank statements, and his most recent charge was only a few hours earlier, and it was at a car repair shop in Buttonwillow, California, which is this small desert town right off of the I-5 highway, located about halfway between his school campus and their hometown in Laguna Niguel. And so Karen and Mike assume their son last night must not have gone to his apartment, but instead just kept on driving south in an attempt to drive all the way back home to his hometown of Laguna Niguel. I mean, after all, he did tell his mom he had a lot to talk about, and he didn't want to talk about it on the phone, and so they assumed he must be driving here to talk about whatever it was in person. And perhaps he ran into some car problems in Buttonwillow, California. That's why he pulled over. That's why there's this charge at this auto repair shop. And so Karen calls the auto repair shop in Buttonwillow, and a man who worked there named Christian answered the phone. And so Karen asked him, have you seen my son? He's got red hair, he's got a tattoo on his arm, he's driving a 2003 Toyota Highlander. And Christian says, oh yeah, we saw him a couple of hours ago. We responded to his roadside assistance call. He ran out of gas on the I-5 highway. He pulled into a rest stop, and we drove to that rest stop and we gave him gas. And so Karen asked Christian, did my son indicate where he was going next? And Christian said, no, he didn't. We just gave him the gas and then we left. But if you'd like, I'd be more than happy to just drive over to the rest stop. It's only about 15 minutes away, and see if he's still there. It's unlikely because it's been a couple of hours, but maybe. And Karen and Mike are like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. Would you do that? That would be great. And so Christian hops in his car and he drives the 15 minutes over to this rest stop, and he's not really expecting to see Bryce in this parking lot. It had been almost 3 hours. But he pulls into the lot, and there is the 2003 Toyota Highlander with Bryce sitting inside of it. He's just sitting behind the wheel, staring out into nothingness. And so Christian walks up to the driver's side and he looks down to get Bryce's attention, and Bryce kind of snaps out of it and looks up, and he's surprised to see Christian again. He rolls the window down, and Christian says to him, hey, I just talked to your parents. They're really concerned about you. You gotta talk to them. And so Christian actually pulls out his phone and he calls Karen and says, hey, he is still here. Here he is. And he hands the phone to Bryce. And as soon as Bryce puts the phone to his ear and he says hello, Karen's like, what are you doing? What are you doing just sitting in this rest stop in the middle of Buttonwillow, California? We're so worried about you. And Bryce didn't really have an answer. He just kept telling his mom, oh, I'm not doing anything. I'm just sitting here. And so finally his mom stops trying to get information from him and just says, look, please just fill your car up with gas and come straight home, please. And Bryce says, okay, yeah, that's what I'll do. I'll do that right now. And so Bryce hands the phone back to Christian. Christian pulls it up to his ear and he says, hey, Karen, it looks like he's leaving now, so I'm going to take off. Karen thanks him and they hang up. Christian goes back into his car. He leaves the lot, and as he's driving, he looks over at Bryce, and it didn't really look like Bryce was getting ready to leave. It looked like he had just gone back to sitting and blankly staring out of his car. But Christian figured, you know what? He just talked to his mom. He said he was going to go home. I'm sure that's what he's going to do. The drive from Buttonwillow, California, south to Laguna Niguel, California, where Bryce's parents were, was about a 3-hour trip. And so the Los Pisos were expecting their son to arrive around 3 p.m. By 3:30 p.m., when he still hadn't shown up and he still hadn't called, Karen began calling her son, but he wasn't answering the phone. And as much as Karen and Mike wanted to believe their son had just gotten stuck in traffic or something like that, they knew deep down something was wrong. Something was off about his behavior. They just didn't understand what it was. For the next several hours, they continuously tried calling their son, and he never answered the phone. And so finally, by 6 p.m. that night, when he still hadn't shown up and they still couldn't get in touch with him, they called the police and they filed an official missing person report. The police began their search by contacting Bryce's cell phone provider, AT&T, and they asked them to use their cell phone towers to ping Bryce's cell phone, basically triangulate where his phone is located. And once they did that and they had the actual location of his phone, the police and Bryce's parents were shocked at where it was. It was still in Buttonwillow, California. It was located just a couple of miles down the road from that rest stop where Christian had last seen Bryce. It was now in this parking lot of this hotel. And so the police around Buttonwillow were alerted to the fact that Bryce was a missing person and his phone was apparently in this parking lot. And so police were sent over there to see if Bryce was there too. And so the police arrive in this hotel parking lot, and sure enough, right in the middle is the 2003 Toyota Highlander with Bryce sitting behind the wheel, just sitting there staring out the front. And so an officer walks up and he knocks on the glass, and Bryce rolls the window down And the officer would say Bryce acted totally normally. He was friendly, he was lucid, he answered all their questions. When he got out of the car and they conducted field sobriety tests, he passed all of them. He even said, hey, if you want to search my car, go for it. I'm not doing anything out here. And so the officers did search his car, and there were no drugs, no alcohol, there was nothing suspicious in his car. And when they asked him, what are you doing out here? Your parents are so concerned about you. And Bryce would tell them that he was just sitting there. He didn't really have much of an answer, but he told them he planned on going home soon. And so one of the officers said to him, hey, you really need to call your mom. You need to call home and let them know that you're okay. And when they told him to do that, Bryce suddenly became really apprehensive, like he did not want to call home. And the officer picked up on it. And he said, hey, you gotta tell your family what's going on. They're the reason we're out here. They're concerned about you. So get out your phone and dial your mom. And so Bryce reluctantly pulled his phone out, he dialed his mother's number and he hit call, and the officer said, give me the phone. So Bryce hands over the phone, the officer picks it up, Karen answers the phone, and the officer tells her, hey, look, I'm with your son, he's just fine, he's sober, there's no drugs, there's no alcohol. I don't really know what he's doing, but he says he's gonna go home pretty soon, but there's nothing wrong about the situation that I can tell. You need to talk to your son and figure out what's going on. And so he hands the phone over to Bryce, Bryce picks it up, and Karen says to him, what's going on? Why are you still in Buttonwillow? It's been like 9 hours. And Bryce really didn't give her an answer to any of her questions. He just kind of deflected all of them and said he'd be home soon and don't worry about it. I'm just sitting here. There's nothing to worry about. And so finally, Karen just stopped trying to pull information out of her son. She could tell that, again, he was not going to tell her what's going on. And so she changed her tactic and she told her son very gently, Bryce, please just go get a bite to eat, get a cup of coffee, kind of get yourself together here, and then please just drive home. It's only a few hours away. Drive home and we can talk about whatever problems you have, but you just gotta drive home. You gotta leave Buttonwillow, you gotta come home. And at this, Bryce says to his mom, you know what? Okay, I'm sorry, I'll be home in a few hours. And so they hang up, and the officer, who was kind of eavesdropping intentionally on this conversation to make sure everything was fine, the officer was satisfied that everything was fine, that Bryce was sober, that he would head home. And so he says, okay, Bryce, best of luck, head home to your parents. And the officer left. An hour later, Karen received a call from Christian, the car repairman who had checked on Bryce earlier. And he was actually returning one of Karen's calls. She'd called him sometime and he didn't get back to her. And so he was calling back and he wanted to know, had Bryce made it home safely? Because now it's been several hours from when he saw him last. And Karen would tell Christian, actually, no. After you left, my son did not leave Buttonwillow. He just went down the road to a parking lot. But, the police actually were just over there. They checked on him. And now I'm certain he's making his way home. Christian, who felt kind of invested in what was happening with Bryce, would say to Karen, hey, I don't mind driving over there and just confirming he has left this parking lot. But Karen would say, you know what, I'm confident he's on his way. Don't worry about it. You're too kind. So they hang up, and afterwards, Christian, even though he didn't have to, he decides, I'm going to go over there and make sure Bryce really has left, because obviously something strange is going on here. And, if there is some problem, maybe I can assist. And so he drives over to this hotel parking lot, and he really was not expecting to see Bryce there. But he pulls into the lot, and who's still in the middle of the lot but Bryce in his 2003 Toyota Highlander, just staring out the front of his car. And so this time, Christian pulls up right next to him, he parks the car, he walks right up to the window, and he's a little bit more forceful, friendly, but forceful with Bryce. He has him roll the window down, and Bryce obviously is very surprised to see Christian again. It's the third time he's seen this car repairman, and Christian says to him, hey, Bryce, you need to go home. Your parents are so worried about you. You need to leave right now. In fact, I'm going to watch you leave, and then I'm going to follow you onto the highway to make sure you're going home. And so Bryce was a little bit taken aback at how forceful he was being, but he would ultimately say, okay, yeah, all right, let's leave. And so Christian gets back in his car and he goes right behind Bryce. And after a few seconds, Bryce pulls out of the lot and he starts driving onto the road, and Christian follows him. And for the next hour, Christian would just remain behind Bryce and watch him drive towards Laguna Niguel. And while he was driving, Christian would actually call Karen and Mike back. And he would say to them that, your son had not left, but now he's good. He's on the highway. I'm right behind him. He'll be home soon. And so when Christian and Bryce made it to the last leg on the way to Laguna Niguel, Christian was confident that Bryce was fine and he would get home under his own steam. He wasn't driving erratically. Everything seemed normal. And so Christian pulled up alongside Bryce. He kind of waved to him to say, I'm leaving. And then he turned around and he headed back to Buttonwillow. Shortly after this, Karen called Bryce. Bryce picked up the phone. He's still driving. And Karen tells him, okay, you're going to give me landmarks of the things you're seeing as you're driving so that I know you're actually driving home. but Bryce refused to give them to her. He would say, "Oh, I can't see anything out my window. It's too dark and I don't know where anything is." And so despite Karen and Mike getting so frustrated with him, saying, "Come on, tell us something, give us a sign, a road sign, anything, tell us anything around you," but Bryce didn't give them any information. And so finally, at about 2 a.m., when Bryce really should have been in Laguna Niguel or very close, he tells his parents over the phone that he's too tired to continue and he needs to pull over and take a nap. At first, his parents urged him to just keep on going. Come home, you can sleep as long as you want when you get here. But as they were saying it, they realized their son had been awake for nearly 24 hours at this point, and it's the middle of the night, so it does kind of make sense for him to pull over and take a nap. And so they say, "Okay, pull over, but as soon as you wake up, you need to call us so we know you're back on the road." So Bryce says, "No problem, I'll do that." And they hang up. Several hours later, at 8 a.m., Karen and Mike have still not heard from their son, and they're telling themselves that he's probably just sleeping, he's totally exhausted, I'm sure he's fine. And then they hear their doorbell ring, and they're immediately so relieved because they're thinking, Bryce is here, he's finally arrived, thank goodness. They run to the door, they open it up, and it's not Bryce, it's a police officer. And the officer asks them, "Do you own a 2003 Toyota Highlander car?" And so Mike and Karen's hearts sank, and they say, "Yes, our son Bryce drives that car." The officer told them that the car had been located a few hours earlier at the bottom of a 25-foot cliff near Castaic Lake. Castaic Lake is about halfway between Button Willow and Laguna Niguel. They told the parents that there was no sign of a driver. Bryce was not there. They did find 2 small drops of blood inside the vehicle, but beyond that, there was no indication that Bryce had sustained life-threatening injuries from this crash. They said the back window of the vehicle had been broken from the inside, indicating that Bryce had escaped the wreck by punching out that window. His laptop and phone were still in the vehicle, and his wallet and duffel bag were outside the vehicle on the road and looked like they had been rummaged through before they were left there. After an examination of the damage to the car, the final tire tracks that led down to where it had been found, and traffic cameras in the area, it was concluded that Bryce had actually intentionally driven off this cliff, and he had actually hit the accelerator right before he went over the edge. After Mike and Karen headed out to the crash scene and had a chance to talk to some of the investigators that had been looking for Bryce, they informed the parents that most likely what they were looking at with this crash was a failed suicide attempt. But Mike and Karen, they just couldn't buy that. That was not like their son. And just 2 weeks earlier, when they dropped him off, he was happy, he was excited to be at school, he was talking about the future. He was not someone that was suicidal. And so what situation could he have possibly gotten himself into in just those 2 weeks that was so bad it would lead to something like this? It made investigators and the parents wonder, was Bryce hiding something? What did he mean when he said he had a lot to talk about? Did that have something to do with this thing he was hiding? A huge search was launched in and around the area where the car had been found, with hundreds of people on horseback, on ATV, on foot. There were helicopters in the air. They put divers in the lake. They looked everywhere for days and days and days, but nothing was found of Bryce. On the 9th day of the search, they brought a bloodhound out to see if it could pick up Bryce's scent, and sure enough, it did, right at the crash site. And the dog followed the scent all the way down to the lake. It walked around the lake to this bridge. It was actually a dam that went across the lake. It followed his scent right across the bridge to the other side, and then it kept on following it up this small access road until it reached a truck stop, and then his scent just stopped. And so police and the parents and everyone involved in this investigation was really surprised at this discovery. And so police got another bloodhound, a separate bloodhound. They brought it out to see if it could do the same thing, to prove that this really was his scent trail. And sure enough, the bloodhound picked up his scent. It went down to the lake, it went around to the bridge, went over, went to the truck stop, and then it just stopped. But after the scent trail was discovered, there was no other leads for anyone to follow. And so after 3 weeks of looking everywhere for Bryce, the search was called off. Some say Bryce was suicidal. That's why he drove off the cliff. That was a suicide attempt. And despite the bloodhounds picking up his scent, Bryce was most likely in the lake somewhere. Others disagree and say Bryce is still alive, that after this crash, he gets out of the car and he walks down to the lake, he walks around to that bridge, he goes up to the truck stop, and then he hitches a ride with someone and vanishes, and now he's living off the grid somewhere. and still others believe Bryce's drug and alcohol use caused a psychotic break, and that was what was causing all this strange behavior, and that was what led him to drive off the cliff, and perhaps when he landed, he sustained a vicious head wound that caused him to forget who he was, and so now he's just kind of wandering around somewhere, not knowing who he is or knowing that he's a missing person. As for his parents, they say he would never do this on purpose. He would never cause this much pain to the people that love him, and so he must have been a victim of foul play. But regardless of what you believe happened to Bryce, something happened to him, and it's probably connected to whatever it was he said he needed to talk to his mom about. That thing that he couldn't discuss on the phone that potentially he was trying to drive home to talk to his mom and dad in person about. But unless we find Bryce and he's still alive, it's unlikely we'll ever know what it was. Since August 30th, 2013, when Bryce went missing, no one has heard from him and no one has seen him. In the early evening of August 28th, 2003, 83-year-old Eric Hingston was sitting up in bed trying to catch his breath in the small village of Plympton in the southwest of England. Eric's 81-year-old wife, Audrey, fluffed up a pillow behind him to make sure he was as comfortable as possible. She kissed her husband on the cheek, walked across the small upstairs bedroom, and opened up the window. A cool summer breeze blew in, and Eric instantly seemed to relax. For the past 3 years, Eric had been dealing with a series of health issues. He could only walk short distances with the help of 2 canes, he had heart problems, and he had a catheter. But despite these health issues, his wife, Audrey, had worked hard to give Eric as active a life as possible. And for years, together, they had managed to do just that. But recently, Eric had also begun to suffer from severe asthma, and so he struggled to breathe a lot of the time. He had tried different medicines and treatments, but sitting upright in his bed with the window open seemed to be the only thing that brought him any relief. Audrey turned from the window and looked back at her husband on the bed, and she smiled. She could see his breathing had started to slow down, and he had a calm look on his face now. Eric gave a little smile back to his wife, but it was obviously forced. He hated that he was stuck in bed so much of the time lately. It was just not how he'd imagined his life playing out. And a big reason for that was because Eric had spent the early part of his life in peak physical condition, facing dangers that most people couldn't even imagine. When he was a young man, he joined the Royal Air Force, and he had become a highly decorated World War II pilot who flew covert missions into occupied France. After leaving the military, he no longer risked his life on a regular basis, but he still pushed himself to work hard all the time and to accomplish any goals he set for himself. Eric got married to his first wife, they started a family, and he opened and ran a very successful neighborhood butcher shop that was located below the house where he still lived. And so for decades, Eric had been a highly respected war hero, business owner, and beloved member of the community. But now, he just felt like a burden. Eric's second wife, Audrey, sat down in a chair near the bed and took his hand. The two of them had gotten married later in life, when they were in their 60s, after both of their first spouses had passed away. Audrey knew Eric hated the situation he was in now, but she reminded him that they had shared almost 20 wonderful years together, and she wouldn't trade that for anything. Audrey asked Eric if he needed any more help, but he just said he just wanted to know how the butcher shop was doing. Audrey shook her head and sighed. One of Eric's sons now ran the family business, and he ran it well, but Eric just could never quite let the shop go. Audrey told him she was sure everything was just fine, but she told him she would head down to look into the shop just to check in on things. And so she patted Eric's hand, stood up, walked out of the bedroom, and down a flight of old wooden stairs, and stepped outside of the house. The street where Audrey and Eric lived in the suburban village of Plympton had barely changed in decades. The butcher shop was connected to the house, but it had its own entrance, and right next door was a popular old neighborhood pub. Stone houses lined the little neighborhood, and Audrey could see the spires of St. Mary's Church, which dated back to the 1300s, rising up in the distance. Audrey walked just a few feet to the entrance of the butcher shop. A bell rang above the door as she stepped inside, and right away she saw Eric's son, James, standing behind the counter and slicing into a piece of meat for a customer. James waved at Audrey, and she walked over, and the two spoke for a few minutes. Eric's children and Audrey's own children had been adults when the couple first got together, so Audrey hadn't played any part in raising Eric's kids. But she'd always gotten along well with all of them, and she was thankful that James had dedicated himself to keeping the family shop up and running. A few more customers walked in, and so Audrey said she didn't want to get in the way of business, so she said goodbye to James and walked back outside. She smiled at a pair of young men who were heading into the pub next door, and she could see the street starting to come to life as people got off from work and headed out for the evening. Audrey took a breath. She missed the days when she and Eric would duck into the pub for a pint and end up talking to their friends for hours, and she knew Eric missed that too. She walked back to the house and put on a smile. She didn't want Eric to see that she was feeling a bit sad about how their lives had changed since he'd gotten sick. Audrey walked upstairs to the bedroom and checked on her husband. He was still sitting up in bed, feeling the breeze on his face. He told her he felt like his breathing was much better, but he was feeling a bit tired, so he might just go to sleep. He asked Audrey to keep the light on, which she almost always did anyways, in case he needed to get up in the middle of the night. Then Eric gave his wife a kiss and closed his eyes. Audrey told him to sleep well. Then she walked to the bedroom door, but she stopped before she walked out. She could hear loud noises coming from the pub next door. She thought about closing the window to block the noise, but she knew Eric could sleep through loud sounds, and having the window open meant he got fresh air. So she left the window open, glanced back at her husband one more time, who was already falling asleep, and then she walked out of the room. At 3:45 a.m. on the following day, August 29th, so several hours after Eric had gone to sleep, Audrey was back in his bedroom, but this time she just stood there in the doorway, trembling. She looked at the open window and then down at the floor, and she felt confused and scared. She slowly walked across the room, picked up the phone on the bedside table, and took a deep breath. With her hands shaking, she dialed 999, the emergency number in the United Kingdom. Minutes after Audrey's call, police and paramedics sped down the small village street towards Audrey and Eric's house, their sirens waking up people all around the quiet neighborhood. Detective Inspector Tony Carney of the Devon and Cornwall Police parked on the street and followed several paramedics to Audrey and Eric's front door. Carney knocked on the door, and within seconds, Audrey answered. The sight of this small, frail-looking older woman in her bathrobe hit Carney hard. She looked terrified, and when Carney introduced himself to her, he could tell she was confused and struggling to put words together. Carney made sure the paramedics could get inside the house and head upstairs to the bedroom, but Carney stayed at the door with Audrey. Carney's first thought was that this poor woman should not be here while the police searched her house. She should be somewhere else where she felt safe and calm. Carney also knew he was dealing with a crime scene here, and he didn't want Audrey to accidentally touch or move potential evidence. So he asked her if there were any family members she might be able to stay with while the police were inside of her home. Audrey looked up at him and slowly nodded. She said her son was a retired police inspector and he lived not too far away. Carney signaled for another officer to come to the door, and he arranged for him to drive Audrey to her son's house. Once Carney felt sure that Audrey would be looked after, he put on his gloves, stepped inside the home, and walked upstairs to the bedroom. And when he got up there, he felt like he'd stumbled into a TV crime drama or something, because on the floor of the bedroom, he saw all the paramedics gathered around Eric Hingston, who had clearly been dead when they got there. And Eric had been brutally stabbed in his collarbone. On several British TV shows, murders took place in small English villages every week. But in reality, murder cases in places like Plimpton were virtually unheard of. And specifically, the murder of an older man in his 80s like Eric was just really not something that ever happened anywhere near here. Carney glanced around the bedroom. All of the dresser drawers had been pulled open, and clothes covered most of the wooden floor. He looked over at the open window, and on the windowsill, he saw a black plastic bin liner, the British term for trash bag. He walked over to the window, looked in the bag, and saw several pieces of expensive jewelry inside. And something outside the window also caught his eye. Carney leaned out, and in the glow of a single outdoor light, he saw a metal ladder perched against the house just below the bedroom window. Just then, Carney heard someone calling his name. He leaned back inside from the window, turned, and saw a small team of forensics officers entering the bedroom. Carney asked the paramedics to clear out, and he gave the forensics team a few minutes to search the room without getting in their way.
and soon it was pretty clear that all the investigators and first responders believed the same thing. This had to have been a robbery gone bad. Someone must have climbed up the ladder into the bedroom, stolen some jewelry, and then Eric must have woken up, tried to stop them, so they killed him. But if that was the case, Carney wondered why the thief had left the jewelry behind. Did they just panic? Or did Audrey catch them in the act? The thief killed Eric, but maybe they just couldn't bring themselves to kill a woman who probably looked a lot like their grandmother. The forensics team continued their work in the bedroom, and Carney headed back downstairs and outside. Police officers had cordoned off the house with crime scene tape, and the neighbors had come out of their homes and had started to ask questions. Carney had worked cases in a number of other small villages, and he knew that even residents with the best intentions could end up slowing down an investigation. News about crimes in these small towns, especially a violent crime, spread fast and led to wild rumors and speculation and misinformation. And people would start calling the police, claiming they saw dangerous criminals on every street corner and in every pub. Carney walked back to his car and called into the station. He said he wanted a mobile command unit set up near the house, and he wanted officers on site whose sole purpose would be to answer questions from the community and provide as much transparency as possible. After that, Carney walked away from his car and informed the officers outside that they would have help soon. But before Carney could go back into the house, he saw another uniformed officer leading a middle-aged man towards him. The man looked almost as dazed as Audrey had. The man introduced himself as the victim's son, James, and he said he ran the family butcher shop connected to the house. A friend who lived nearby had called him to tell him what was going on, and James said he had spoken to the uniformed officer, so he already knew his dad was dead. Carney eyed James and then looked over at the shop. He wondered if it was too much of a coincidence that James worked at a butcher shop, presumably with knives, and his father was the murder victim who had been stabbed to death. James told Carney he still needed to call the rest of his family to let them know what had happened. Carney said he understood. However, before he left, he wanted to know if anyone who worked at the butcher shop, or anyone who might have worked there in the past, could possibly have had a grudge against his father. James shook his head and said no. He said police could talk to anyone who had ever worked for his dad, or anyone in the neighborhood for that matter, and they would all say they loved Eric, like family. Carney said how sorry he was again, and then told James he would follow up when he needed to, and then Carney walked back inside the house. Up in the bedroom, Carney found the forensics team combing over every inch of the floor and also bagging jewelry and clothing as potential evidence. One of the officers told Carney that they had pulled blood samples from Eric's body, but they hadn't found that much blood on the floors or the walls. They believed the stab wound had been deep enough to puncture Eric's lung and kill him, but it hadn't actually caused a lot of bleeding. The forensics officer said the puncture spot on Eric's body was deeper than it was wide, which most likely meant the blade was very, very sharp. The officer also said that they still had not found the murder weapon or any usable fingerprints in the room or outside of the window, but they would keep on looking. Carney hoped the team would eventually find usable prints, but he thought he might not even need them, because he believed there was a good chance Audrey had interrupted the robbery and gotten a good look at her husband's killer. On August 30th, so a day after the discovery of Eric's body, Carney and his partner, Neil Treby, knocked on the front door of a small house in a town not far from Plimpton. A man in his mid-50s answered. He told the investigators that he was Audrey's son, and that yes, he was a retired police detective sergeant. Carney and Treby felt lucky their potential main witness's son was a former cop. He could help them explain what was happening in the investigation to his mother, and also maybe make her feel safer and more comfortable when she was speaking to them. Audrey's son led them into the front room of the house, where Audrey was sitting on the couch. Somehow, she looked even smaller and more frail than the day before when Carney had met her. But Audrey smiled and politely asked if the officers wanted a cup of tea or coffee. They thanked her, but they said they were fine for now, and then Audrey's son sat down next to his mother, and the investigators sat in chairs across from them. Carney said how sorry he was for her loss. He knew this must all be frightening and confusing. Audrey nodded, but she said she would not let fear or confusion get in the way of helping the police. And then, without any prompting, she said she had seen the men who killed her husband in the bedroom. Carney leaned in and asked if he'd heard her right. There was more than one killer? Audrey nodded and said there were 2 young men. Treby quickly asked if she knew these men, or if she could at least give a clear description of them. Audrey turned and looked at her son, and he told her she should tell them everything she knew. Audrey turned back to the investigators. She told them she had been sleeping in the guest bedroom, and she said she usually did that because Eric liked to keep the window open and the light on at night, which made it difficult for her to fall asleep. And so the other night, or early in the morning, she had woken up when she heard noise coming from the main bedroom where Eric was sleeping. It sounded like someone was groaning and something banging against the wall. Audrey said she figured it was just Eric trying to fumble for his canes to try to stand up and get out of bed, and so she got up and walked down the hall. And at this point, Audrey sort of trailed off. She seemed like she couldn't go on with her story. The investigators didn't want to push her, but her son gently encouraged her to keep going. And at some point, Audrey did begin talking again. She said when she got to the bedroom, her husband was lying on the floor, bleeding, and there were these 2 young men standing over him. One was holding a knife, and the other was holding a plastic bag. She screamed, and when she did, they ran for the window, climbed out, and disappeared. However, the one that had been holding the bag dropped the bag on the way out. But Audrey said before they escaped, she did get a good look at them. She said she didn't know their names, but she definitely recognized them from the village, and they were really distinct looking. She said one was kind of short, maybe 5'8", and the other was at least 6'1", and he wore bright white pants and a deerstalker hat, just like the one Sherlock Holmes wore. Carney glanced over at his partner. He didn't say anything, but a killer wearing bright pants and also wearing a Sherlock Holmes-style hat seemed really bizarre, sort of like he was on some fictional TV crime drama. Carney asked Audrey if she wouldn't mind giving a detailed description of these 2 men to a police sketch artist. He also said that he didn't want to pressure her, but if she was willing to go on TV and speak directly to the public about what these men looked like, it could be helpful. Audrey turned and spoke to her son for a few moments, and then after that, she turned back to the investigators and nodded her head. She agreed to do anything that would help get her justice for her husband and bring some closure for his kids. On September 4th, so 5 days after Eric's murder, Inspectors Carney and Treby stood next to Audrey in a large conference room filled with newspaper and television reporters. Police had already started to circulate the drawings of the suspects around town. But Plimpton was just one of several small villages that surrounded the much larger city of Plymouth, so the investigators believed getting the description out on television was key to reaching more people across the entire area. The investigators also believed if people just saw Audrey telling her tragic story, they might be more willing to help. Carney conveyed the basics of the case to the press, and then he introduced Audrey. She stood there for a second in silence, just staring out at the cameras pointed directly at her. She tried to keep her composure, and she spent a minute looking at some notes she had written down. Finally, in a soft voice, she thanked the community for all the love and support they had shown her and her family in the wake of this tragedy, and then she gave a detailed description of the 2 men she believed killed her husband. Afterward, Audrey stopped and looked down at the piece of paper shaking in her hands. She swallowed and closed her eyes, trying to fight back tears. After a few seconds, she opened her eyes, looked right into one of the cameras, and said very dramatically that there was no need for these men to have done this to Eric. Even if he had tried to fight them off, he was no threat to these 2 young men. They could have just pushed him aside and left with whatever they wanted. They didn't have to kill him. This press conference sparked an even bigger outpouring of sympathy for Audrey and the family, but it also led to a level of tension and fear that was totally foreign inside of Plimpton. People were now too scared to go out at night, and shopkeepers considered closing their doors early just in case these 2 murderous young men were out stalking their next victim. However, within just a few days, Audrey's press conference would prove to have been the right decision. On an afternoon in early September, Carney and Treby were working together in Carney's office when a uniformed police officer opened the door. He told them that 2 men had come to the station saying they needed to speak to the investigators who were handling the Eric Hingston murder case, because they said they were the men that Audrey had identified as being the killers. Inspectors Carney and Treby rushed through the station, and they found these 2 young men standing with several officers. And they did look exactly like the 2 young men Audrey had described. The inspectors felt a huge rush because it was like the solution to their case had just fallen right into their laps. Carney and Treby brought the 2 young men into an interview room, and Carney asked them flat out if they had come to turn themselves in for Eric's murder. But both young men immediately just shook their heads and said no. The taller of the 2 men said they'd seen Audrey's press conference, and they immediately knew she was describing them. But they had nothing to do with her husband's murder. Treby said if they knew immediately that they were the men Audrey was talking about, why had they waited several days to come in? The young men looked at each other for a second, and then the tall one kept talking for both of them. He said they were scared. Not only did they match Audrey's description, but they also thought people in the village would decide they were guilty right away no matter what they said, because they happened to live in a bail hostel in town. A bail hostel was a place where people who had been charged for crimes but had been released on bail could live if they didn't have a permanent residence of their own. Essentially, a bail hostel allowed law enforcement to know where they could find these people if they needed to until their case went to trial. Carney and Treby exchanged a look. They knew these young men were right. A lot of people in the village would assume they were dangerous criminals and decide they were guilty of murder regardless of the truth. But this didn't change the fact that Audrey had clearly described both of them, so Carney wanted to know how they could explain that, if they were not the men Audrey had seen in Eric's room. The shorter of the 2 men finally spoke up. He said he didn't mean any disrespect, but the old woman might just be confused. They had seen her that day, but not in her house. Instead, they had seen her when they were walking into a nearby pub. The taller man then quickly joined in and said after going to that pub, they went back to the bail hostel and stayed in all night. And they said the inspectors could speak to the people in charge of the hostel because the hostel had strict curfews and kept track of when people left and came back. Carney and Treby got the details of this bail hostel, then excused themselves and left the interview room. And immediately, Carney called the hostel, and the person who answered was able to confirm that both of those men were at the hostel at the time of Eric's murder. And so any rush of adrenaline the inspectors had felt when these 2 men came to the station had now quickly disappeared. Now, there was a chance that these young men could have snuck out of the hostel and made their way to Eric and Audrey's without anybody noticing, but that was not the most likely scenario, especially considering that these 2 men had literally sought out the police. And if Audrey really had seen them at the pub that day, there was a chance that in her shock and confusion, she had just remembered these 2 guys when she was trying to picture the men who were inside of her house. Carney and Treby returned to the interview room. They let the 2 young men go, but made it clear they would follow up with the bail hostel, so the men should make sure not to leave the village anytime soon. But once the young men were gone, Carney and Treby admitted that if Audrey had confused these 2 guys with the actual killers, the investigation basically had nothing to go on. With 2 potential suspects off their list for the time being, Carney and Treby decided to head back to Eric and Audrey's neighborhood. At the mobile command center the police had set up near the house, the inspector spoke with shop owners, old family friends, and delivery drivers and paperboys who might have seen something while they were on their routes early in the morning when Eric was killed. But nobody seemed to have seen or heard anything unusual. And so with very little to go on, Carney and Treby couldn't help but keep coming back to the idea that their victim ran a butcher shop and he had been stabbed with what forensics officers believed was a very sharp blade, something that would be in a butcher shop. So maybe 2 men from the shop had broken into the house and killed Eric with a butcher knife. They most likely would have had easy access to the home, working so close. But when they spoke to Eric's son James and the few other people who worked at the shop, all of them appeared to have very strong alibis, so the inspectors could not directly tie any of them to the break-in or to Eric's murder. On September 11th, 2 weeks after the murder, Carney and Treby started to feel like the case was already slipping away from them. Their interactions in the community had not yielded any new evidence. Forensics officers had returned to the house, but still had not found any usable prints, and test results from the blood samples taken from Eric's body and the bedroom floor only matched Eric. And to make things even more bleak for the investigation, several people connected to the bail hostel had now officially corroborated the young men's alibi. So it seemed like the killer in the bright white pants with the Sherlock Holmes hat was really just a product of Audrey's fear and confusion. That day, while Carney and Treby continued to look for anything they might have missed in their case files, they suddenly got a call from a police officer in a nearby town. They put the call on speakerphone, and they could both tell right away that this officer sounded upset. He said he had been dispatched to Audrey's son's house because Audrey had attempted suicide by overdosing on pills. The officer said that paramedics had gotten Audrey to the hospital fast enough to save her life, but he also said he had found a suicide note on site, and the note read, "Please catch the terrible people who ruined my life. I cannot live without Eric." As soon as Carney and Treby hung up, a sense of guilt hit both of them. They knew their investigation had not really been going on that long, but the fact that they still had not found the killers had clearly taken a toll on Audrey. Carney and Treby left the station and headed right to the hospital to check on Audrey in person. When they arrived, they learned that Audrey was okay, however, for now, she just needed to rest and recover on her own. So, the inspectors, instead of speaking to Audrey, spoke briefly with a social worker who had met with Audrey when she was first brought into the hospital. And after this conversation, the inspectors decided they needed to start from scratch. There had to be something inside of Audrey and Eric's house that they and their team had simply missed, and they had to make sure they found it before anything like the suicide attempt happened again. Not long after this hospital visit, Carney and Treby led their investigative team back to Audrey and Eric's house. And this time, they wanted to recreate the robbery and murder as best as they could, hoping this might lead to hidden fingerprints or some new idea about what could have happened. They started by having 2 police officers place the ladder outside against the house, scale it, and then try to climb into the bedroom window. And what they discovered is because of the way the window was designed and where it was situated in the house, it meant that somebody would have to awkwardly stretch up from the ladder, grab onto a small piece of cement, and pull themselves up and over the windowsill and into the bedroom. This proved to be so difficult that even the youngest, most fit cop on the team couldn't do it. And so the only other option for the killers, assuming they were using this ladder, would have been to use the ladder to climb onto the roof of the house and then scale down from the roof and sort of swing themselves into the bedroom. And this scenario, much like the first one, required a lot of strength and to some degree a level of fearlessness because the risk of falling was quite high. And even with all that, it still would have been really hard to pull off. So police wondered if maybe the killers had somehow practiced this maneuver beforehand. After the investigative team tried several more times to run through various ladder scenarios, they headed back inside the house to do another complete search. Now, Carney and Treby had no idea if during this search they would find anything new. The house had already been searched on 3 separate occasions. But they still encouraged their team to literally look everywhere in this house, even in places where it didn't even seem possible that a clue could turn up. And after another lengthy search, when Carney and Treby had both become convinced that they were going to come up short again, they heard an officer shouting their names from the kitchen. Carney and Treby ran through the house. In the kitchen, they saw an officer standing by an open drawer with his back to them. Carney asked what was going on, and the officer said he'd found something that was stuck in the small space between the drawer and the counter the drawer was in. Carney and Treby just stood there with bated breath as this officer jimmied the drawer to try to free what was stuck there. And then finally, the officer got it free, and he turned around, and in a gloved hand, he showed them what was stuck. It was a knife with a red handle and a sharp 7-inch blade. It was the type of knife that would most likely be used by a chef or a butcher. That knife was immediately sent to the crime lab for testing, and when the results from those tests came back, it only confirmed what Carney and Treby already knew. This knife had cracked Eric's murder case. Based on test results from the crime lab, forensic evidence, and interviews conducted during the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Eric Hingston. In the early morning hours of August 29, 2003, the killer dragged a tall metal ladder from Eric and Audrey's back garden to the side of the house. It was dark, except for a couple of house lights on the street, and the neighborhood was completely quiet. The killer placed the ladder against the house beneath the bedroom window, and as they placed it there, the metal of the ladder clanged against the concrete of the house, and the killer froze. They looked around nervously, but there were no signs that the noise they had just made had attracted any attention. So, after that, the killer, instead of walking up the ladder, walked around to the front door of the house and went inside. And they headed up the stairs, holding a sharp 7-inch blade in one hand and a plastic bin liner in the other. Each step they took on the staircase made the house creak, so the killer moved slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The killer reached the top of the stairs, walked down a short hallway, and entered the bedroom where Eric was sleeping. The light was on, and the killer saw Eric sitting up in his bed. However, he was fast asleep. The killer placed the plastic bag down on the floor, then took a breath, gripped the knife tight, and walked across the room. They stood over the side of the bed, staring down at Eric. Then they raised the knife up and slammed it down into Eric's collarbone. Eric woke up, wheezing and trying to scream. Blood began running down his shirt, and he used all of his strength to pull himself up out of bed, but as soon as he was up, he just collapsed and fell to the floor. The killer just stood there, watching Eric as his breathing got slower and more strained until Eric went still. He had died. The killer then walked to the dresser, opened up the drawers, and began tossing articles of clothing all over the floor. When they had almost emptied the dresser, they stopped, went over and grabbed their bin liner, and then walked over to a jewelry box that was sitting on the bedroom vanity, and they dumped most of the jewelry that was inside of it into the liner. The killer carried the now full bag across the room and placed it on the windowsill. Then they looked outside through the open window to make sure the ladder was still in place, and it was. Satisfied, the killer left the bedroom, went downstairs, but instead of going outside, they went into the kitchen, and they calmly hid the murder weapon in the space between a kitchen drawer and the counter. After that, the killer walked to the front room, sat down on the couch, and waited almost 2 hours before they called the police to report a robbery and a murder that had taken place inside of their own home. "81-year-old Audrey Hingston had murdered her husband." It turned out that Audrey had grown tired of having to take care of Eric full-time. She missed her old life of going out, visiting the pub, and spending time with her friends. Over the years, Eric's health issues had started to make her feel completely trapped, so she came up with a plan to kill him and make it look like a robbery. Audrey went as far as to pick the two young men she would pin the murder on. She often saw these two young men walking around the neighborhood and visiting the pub, then she knew they lived in the bail hostel, so she thought they would look guilty. But even after these suspects that Audrey identified came to police and provided strong alibis, Carney and Treby didn't turn their attention to Audrey and think she was guilty. Instead, they truly believed that Audrey had just been confused, and that she really had seen two young men robbing her house and killing her husband, just not these two young men. However, following Audrey's suicide attempt, the inspectors met with a social worker who'd been speaking to Audrey. And the social worker said it was so strange, but despite what Audrey's notes said about the reason she had attempted suicide was because of her grief over her husband's death, that this social worker's experience with Audrey had been that Audrey had almost no grief or sadness about her husband being dead. And so after hearing this, the inspectors did not immediately believe this 81-year-old woman was a murderer, but they thought she might not be telling them the whole truth about what had happened. And so it was at that point that they tried to recreate the break-in using the ladder outside to get a better idea of what Audrey might have witnessed. But the inspectors quickly discovered that it would have been incredibly difficult, if not downright impossible, to pull off the break-in using the ladder. So when police found the knife hidden in the kitchen, they felt confident that there had not even been a robbery at all. that nobody had used the ladder to break in, and that instead, very likely, someone close to Eric had simply entered his house through the front door and killed him. Now, at this point, the inspectors suspected that either Eric's son, James, or maybe one of the other workers at the butcher shop were the killer. However, the only DNA found on that knife discovered in the kitchen was Audrey's. The inspectors had followed up with James, and when he heard about this knife that was found in the kitchen, he was in complete shock. Because he said just a week before the murder, Audrey had come into the butcher shop and asked him to sharpen that specific knife. After Carney and Treby confronted Audrey with all of this evidence, her son, who was the former policeman, was sure his mother had killed Eric, and he convinced her to confess. At the time, Audrey became one of the oldest women in British history to be jailed for murder. But because of the circumstances and her age, she actually only served 7 months in prison. After her release, she was banned from returning to Plimpton or contacting Eric's family for several years. Audrey died in 2016. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds